Yes, hello and welcome back to the stream of Karim Talks About Economics, and this is the sixth podcast. As always, I'm gonna start out because it is still in the beginning stages. I'm receiving a call, which might be from our guest today. Hi, Oma. What's up? Yes, I am live at this exact second. I started less than a minute ago now. Great. We'd love that. We'd love that. It would even be nice if you could come in on Skype. If we can make that happen today, it would be nice to look at what Generation Z thinks about the situation that we're living in, maybe also why they are maybe prioritizing the environment and the social equality more than the financial equality. Well, I could make it loud. Yes, yes, just talk. Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, what was the question again?
Well, let me first introduce you then properly. So,
Oh, okay.
yes. So, yes, this is my cousin Omar, the one who commented a lot on the past video, episode 5. And we thought it would be a great idea, after a small discussion, that maybe he joined and he gave us his perspective on economics and how Generation Z thinks about not only the situation that we're living in at the moment, but maybe also um, how they think about economy in general. So, Omar, I
Yes.
think that we should just get into it. Let's be spontaneous here. I've not planned a lot, but this is a question that I've thought about. I think you're in the same age group, if not the exact same age, as Greta Thunberg.
What's Greta Thunberg?
G- Greta
Oh,
Thunberg.
Greta
Yeah,
Thunberg.
Greta
Okay, sorry, I've
Thunberg.
never
Yeah,
heard it like that
that's
before.
yeah. She's Scandinavian, so that's how you really pronounce her name. But yeah,
Oh, okay, okay.
you're in the same age, and that relates to the question that I asked you while you were on pause or on silent mode, and that was, from my perspective as a little bit older, I see that your generation mostly focuses on um, the social equality and the environment and things like that rather than the economic equality between people. Is that true, firstly? And if so, why?
Um, I would say that is true. Personally, my views diverge from that a tiny bit. I share my own beliefs, but generally, as a whole, if we are looked at as a population as a whole, we do believe and we do hold moral and environmental standpoints higher than economic standpoints
Yeah,
and values.
yeah,
And so yes, so I would say that is true.
yeah. But how do you create these moral standpoints?
Pardon me?
You said that you hold these moral standpoints a little bit higher than maybe economic standpoints, or I don't know, of the finance
Yeah.
behind it and the politics behind it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
how do you define these moral standpoints? Like how do you come up with them? I mean,
Well, personally, I would define them as anything that would benefit humanity as a whole. Right? The world, especially the Western world, has been run on benefiting the economy and benefiting the state more than I would say the people. Right? And the world that I'm going to be living in the future, is going to be destroyed environmentally. So that's another moral standpoint right there. It's going to be destroyed environmentally if we don't take any action right now.
Yeah.
I don't think money's going to matter in the future. So, and I think things that are going to matter are going to be things like taking care of our health, taking care of the Earth's health. Things like that are going to matter, not money.
Okay. That's an interesting standpoint. How do you see money? So in my previous podcast, we've had some discussions, me and the audience, or the audience and I, um, uh, about what money really is. But that's from the standpoint of Adam Smith, of course, right? Money is not necessarily the coins and the banknotes that you have in your wallet and things like that, but maybe rather
Yeah.
what you can
What it means for you.
not only, yeah, that, but also what you can exchange for it, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing that you say money doesn't matter anymore. So what do you think is going to matter?
No, I don't. I don't think it's not going to matter entirely. Money's still going to have value. By don't matter, I mean it's not going to matter as much. It's going to matter to a lesser extent than taking care of our environment. Money's not going to mean anything. It's not going to have. Money's not going to help us when the Earth is, when global warming takes over and it's 60 degrees Celsius in Saudi Arabia, right? It's not going to help us when there's flooding here in Canada. It's not going to help us when there's flooding in Denmark.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by that. And I do get your point of looking at money. Money isn't just coins and stuff. Personally, I look at money as freedom.
Yeah.
So it doesn't only have to be coins, but that freedom isn't really going to matter if we're confined inside of our homes because, there's chaos out onto the streets.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna try to take it a step back, just so we get a common ground, and then let's see if we can actually build upon what you said. So let me ask you a question firstly. Do you think when you said money is not going to be matter, or the value of money is not going to be that important, do you think that is because the basic necessities will be fulfilled with a minimal amount of money, and you will not be able to get any utility from having a lot of money?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. That's quite interesting. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think the world's viewpoint in 100 years, or let's just keep it in my generation, in 50, 60 years, right, it's going to change from more materialistic to more about people and more about morals and the way that things work and stuff like that.
Mm. Okay.
Yeah, the viewpoint's definitely going to change from materialistic.
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask you another question then. Do you think the world is going to be more globalized, in the sense that you will think about these moral standpoints not only in the perspective, or if for the Western people, for the people living in the Western world, or will that be more? Mm, that do you think, okay, let me ask it differently, do you think that at some point we might demonstrate for people in different countries, or will we still only be concerned with our problem and try to increase our own living standards?
No. I think I see what you were saying, and I think that we are going to be more global in the way that we think, and you can even see it with us right now in 2020, Greta Thunberg and other people that advocate for things that are happening overseas. People are becoming less involved with themselves and more involved with humanity as a whole and the globe as a whole.
Hmm.
And that viewpoint is definitely going to get stronger and stronger the more that we go, the more that we head into the future.
Yeah.
The more that we realize that money isn't really everything, and money isn't what's going to drive the world anymore.
Yeah.
And it's more about people's actions.
Okay. Yeah. You said something at the start when you discussed finance. when you said that money will not matter, and that we're going to care more about the moral standpoints. You argued that maybe what has been happening at this point was that the state wanted to gain more and more control, if I remember correctly. And then you said something about it's going to be more about the people. For me, it sounds like you're putting the state on one hand and the benefit of the people in another, on the other hand. Do you think
Yeah.
those two are
Not
going
entirely.
against each other, or how do you see it?
Not entirely, but for example, like a totalitarian state, right? A totalitarian dictatorship or rising totalitarian dictatorships, like for example, like what happened in Europe before World War II, right before World War II.
Okay.
That's what I believe has been happening, right? It's the health of the state, the health of the country over the people's. That doesn't mean that the health of the state and the health of the people, those don't go hand in hand. I do believe that they do go hand in hand. However, I believe that there's a bigger focus on the health of the state over the health of the people, and that's going to change. That's going to flip 180.
Okay. But don't you think that the health of the state comes from the health of the people?
No, I don't. Because, for example, the people could suffer, like what happened in Nazi Germany, right? People suffered,
okay.
Man. German Jewish people suffered. Gypsies, they suffered. Other different, black people in Germany suffered. However, the state itself rose in power. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily come from the power that people have.
Okay, I see you. Yeah, definitely. When it comes to those, of course, those people suffered, and I think they made they more than suffered. To
And I
be
believe
to
the
be
modern
to
Western
be
world
honest with you,
benefits, and it was built on the back of the same kind of leadership. However, it's much more, it's lesser than what happened in Germany.
Yeah,
America,
but
for instance, was built on the back of black slaves, right?
okay.
That's
Okay.
not for the people. And then hundreds of, after slavery ended,
that's an extreme part of it, though.
Systematic racism.
That's an extreme part of it, if you ask me. And the thing with Nazi Germany and the Jews and and the other people that they oppressed, well, they did not gain any financial benefit out of that. So the state rose to power mm, as a war nation, yes, but it's not because, well, if you look at it from an economics point, why you're talking to an economist now, of course I'm going to put it into economics. I don't suppose that the GDP of Germany itself did increase in that period of time. Now, and with respect to slavery, even I have personally not looked into it with great detail, and therefore I'm very hesitant to say anything about it. I can only talk from what Adam Smith has told me, which is that slavery was actually quite unprofitable. Um, because you had, well, he argues that you had to take care of the slaves. It doesn't make sense to take care of the slaves and force them to do stuff with, and providing them housing and food and provide and like mm, giving them exactly what giving them exactly a commodity of food. It would be better for them to trade with other people in the economy as white people, right? So Adam Smith, he was against slavery, but not because it was oppression, but rather because um, it was unprofitable.
Against it for the wrong reasons.
Well, he's against it from an economic standpoint, right? You're against it, and today, I
Not
suppose.
From a moral standpoint.
Yeah, I think we're against things for a moral standpoint. But do you think that the moral standpoint is sustainable?
I do think so. I mean, we've come at a point in life, man, when everything is accessible. Food is so highly accessible, you know, in comparison to what it was 100 years ago. Food is accessible. Housing is accessible. Uh, everything, transportation is accessible. Everything's accessible, man. You don't even need a car nowadays. You can Uber wherever the hell you need to go, right? Um, so many things, so many commodities that people couldn't even fathom, so many luxuries that we have today that people couldn't even fathom to have hundreds of years ago, we do have and we take for granted today. And now realize that it's not all about them. Like you know, do I make sense? We've already reached that point of living comfortably. So now we just need to focus on people once more.
That's an interesting point of looking at it. Um, mm,
Like there's always advancements
yeah,
in medicine and in everything, but we've reached a point where we're pretty much stable and we're, I would say, satisfied.
that's
Would you agree?
interesting. That's interesting. The thing that has
At least
fueled,
my generation. I'm speaking from the point of view of my generation, right? The future generation. We've reached the point of view where we're pretty much satisfied with, not completely. You know, there's always going to be things that we're going to change and evolve, but we're satisfied with where we are at when it comes to technological advancements and stuff. Uh, so we need to fix our focus from that to taking care of people and taking care of humanity, whether that's people that live here in the states that we live in or people that live overseas.
okay, yeah, I see your point. Um, However, the thing that has fueled humanity, at least the Western world, I'd also like to argue that it's the entire world. Well, that is being innovative, right? Doing something.
Correct.
Um, of course, you have not mentioned how we would go about to create these equalities, improving the health of the globe, right? Without risking decreasing the standard of living. So for me, um, we need more innovation, right?
Yeah,
We need more
I agree.
investments in these areas. Um, to clean up the oceans, you need some sort of ship or some sort of machine that can go and detect these things and make them into something new that can be reused. I've worked on something called Periscope, where we try to look at these kind of new technologies that might help the improvement of the maritime industry. Right, we looked into how
Would you say? Sorry.
to look
What
into
would you say?
different fuels and things like that. And one thing is, and let me just give you an example that I've seen now being utilized. I even saw it quite randomly on Instagram also, that you could, for instance, have bubbles underneath the sea, rivers at least, right? That would rise up the plastic, and you would then be able to collect it without harming fish and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the Generation Z's opinion on that? Would they want to work towards something like that, or do you think they are satisfied by demonstrating? I think this is, and sorry for putting it so black and white.
Um. Well, are you finished?
Yes, yeah, I'm
Oh, okay,
finished.
okay. Sorry, I thought you were thinking. See, we need that Skype call, man,
Yeah,
so I could see the expressions and everything.
yeah.
Um. Well, see, you mentioned innovation, right? The current, it's not always innovation that drives people. You know that, right? Um, and a good example of that is oil versus electric powered machinery, right? Oil isn't something new. Oil isn't something innovative, right? Oil's been around forever. Electric powered vehicles, for example, like electric powered cars like Tesla, that's what's new and that's what's innovative. But that's not what's used. It's we still rely heavily on oil. So that totally discredits your point of view of innovation driving the Western world.
Well, I wouldn't agree with you there, because you need oil to, at least in a huge part of the world, to create electricity.
Not necessarily. There's many ways of creating
Yeah.
electricity that doesn't require oil.
Yes,
Hydrogens,
yes,
wind turbines.
yes. Of course, but they are not in many parts of the world. They are not profitable enough yet, right? Uh,
Geothermal electric generation. That's pretty much that's accessible in that.
yeah.
Pretty much all parts of I'm not very educated on it. That's accessible in pretty much all parts of the world. They can capture heat from the core, from the center, as close as they can get to the center of the earth, and they use that heat to rotate wheels on axles to generate electricity. They rotate turbines to generate electricity.
Yes.
So that's pretty much accessible in most parts of the world, and that's highly innovative. Would you agree?
Definitely.
Yeah, and that's not being used at all. We're still relying on what's profitable.
It's quite interesting that you say that, right? But because you take it as a given that we know, yes, it does exist, but you're taking for a given that we can actually extract it and create energy out of it just because we know the theory. Because the practical thing behind it is much, much, much more complicated than that.
Oh, we can. We absolutely can. There's documented cases of that being utilized already. The problem is it's not profitable. Nuclear reactors, for example, that's another power generating device that we don't use. It's highly innovative that we don't use because it's not profitable, and they've been shown to be much more eco-friendly than oil.
Well, I can agree with you there. However, they are of course, risky, right?
Well, of course, there is a risk with them, but they are more eco-friendly than oil. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Of course, they don't emit anything. Um, but yeah. But yeah, if I can get back to that question about the thing that I put in very black and white, which is about demonstrating and about action. Um, do you think that the new generation, your generation, maybe also our generation, is going to work towards something, try to be innovative, right? To try to find something that is going to be profitable? Or do you think that we'll boycott things such that we make them profitable?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
In my opinion,
Okay.
It's never good. It's never good to boycott anything.
Okay.
What's best? The best course of action to take is for us to innovate something new rather than exempt and hold back something that already exists.
Okay.
Right? If something better exists, people are always going to move to whatever's best for them. Right? Whatever's best for them, and that's you can go back to our points of view being changed from an economic standpoint to a moral standpoint. Right? So now that our main standpoint and our main goals in life are no longer economic for Gen Z, no longer economic and more moral and more about the environment, right? What people are going to want more are more eco-friendly things, environmentally friendly things, right? So they're going to move towards things that are better for the environment, such as nuclear reactors, such as electric cars, such as this and that.
Interesting.
So innovation's always going to drive the world. Innovation's always going to drive humanity forward. People are always going to want easier ways to do things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So something like a new Facebook, something that is so innovative as Facebook, right? Well, one could argue that MySpace was before Facebook and was the pioneers, but it was really Facebook that made it a common standard to have a social and virtual not only a platform but a profile, right? Do you
Mm-hmm.
think we'll see um, something like that soon, or in the future, or in the very
I
near future?
I wouldn't know. I would assume not, right? Because they already exist. Uh, something entirely something entirely different than Facebook. I mean, things other than Facebook have been invented already, right? Like Instagram,
Yeah,
Snapchat, uh, LinkedIn, whatever,
yeah,
Twitter. So things of that nature have already been invented. If you're talking about a whole different medium, a
yeah,
whole different idea, then I have no clue.
yeah. Okay. The yeah the hint was something that is going to change the way that we live, right? Something like Apple, something like Facebook. Um,
Mm.
Maybe because you're a little bit younger than me, you've seen something in the behavior of people, or maybe a new thing, a new twist on something that you find very very interesting. That would have been very
Oh,
cool.
I'll tell you this. We
Yeah.
have we have spoken about this a couple of weeks ago, right? People's behaviors on Instagram have changed dramatically between, like, for example, your behavior versus my generation's behavior, my age group's behavior. For example,
Yeah.
you would post daily everything on Instagram, right? Whatever happens, hey, I ate this, I'll Instagram it. I traveled here, I'll Instagram it. I do this, I'll Instagram it. And then you would have thousands and thousands of or hundreds or thousands of Instagram posts by the end of, a while. In a while,
Yeah.
you have that much. However, when you look now, my generation, we post very rarely. We post once in a while, maybe once every 2 or 3 months at best. And those portraits are basically the best versions of ourselves. And then the rest,
Interesting.
things that we want to share with people on a day-to-day basis, we would share maybe through Snapchat or something. So um, the significance, I would
Hmm.
say, of that is people are becoming less social, I would say, and I entirely disagree with it, and I hate it. As a matter of fact, people are becoming unbelievably antisocial in the sense that they don't share themselves as much as they used to. And so before, the focus as the 21st century came along was to advertise yourself from person to person to on social media. Right now, that's even changing. Now people are just becoming antisocial as a whole.
But is that because you don't and let's remove the corona period out of this, but is that because you meet less people, or is it because you're afraid of failure, or
I
what
have no
is it
clue. Me
that's
personally,
driving this?
me personally, I don't abide by it because I think it's dumb. I like to post as many things as I can, and I like to put myself out there. But I've noticed that with people my age, the majority of them, they don't they abide by that rule. They don't follow what I follow.
Yeah. Okay. But do you also think that that will translate into less people using those platforms um, as a mean of advertising, for instance?
I No, I disagree. I mean, more people are using Instagram, so advertisers are still getting their ads out to as many people.
Yeah.
It's just the users aren't as they're still as active on the app and still as active on the platform. They're just not uploading pictures of themselves.
Okay.
They're not using it to be social. They're using it more to view other people's posts, like celebrities and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because and I think that's a testament to how huge Instagram and other social media platforms like that have gotten. Right? They're no longer to chat between friends. Now they're just there to view creators. It's more
Mm.
like YouTube. Like Instagram has changed to YouTube in some sense.
Okay.
Like how many people do you know post videos on YouTube?
Personally,
Yeah,
none.
yeah, exactly. See, YouTube. People
Yeah.
use YouTube, and people. watch TV and stuff like that to watch and view people that they adore and people that they like, and rarely post on them. And that's how Snapchat's becoming. And I've actually never made that connection until now, so I really appreciate this call.
That's great. So you said something, right? They are using these platforms to watch, which in my ears sounds like entertainment.
Yeah.
Now, is that because now they prefer this way of entertainment because it's the new age, or is it because you feel that people have more time to spare?
I would say this is the new form of entertainment. You can even look at TikTok as an example.
Okay.
Vine went out of business, right?
That's true.
Vine,
yes.
Musically, platforms like that went out of business because I don't know exactly why, but people's attention spans then weren't as short as they are now.
Yeah.
I can't hold it longer as a conversation longer than 10 seconds with my sister, man. She dozes off. You know, people.
Oh.
The new form of entertainment is very fast paced and it's very short attention span. People don't focus. People want their information quick, and I think that's because of the availability of information. There's information everywhere, right? So it's whoever can get me the information the fastest that I'm going to listen to.
Yeah, it's good that you said that yourself, right? Because that relates to an idea that I was a little bit hesitant to say at our first discussion, if I may move back to that about the moral standpoint, right? Where you and I'm going to rephrase my question, right? Um, Maybe because it was a little bit aggressive how I stated it the first time, where I said you just expect that these technologies exist, right? And that's the thing. You want something. You said oil versus electricity. Yes, there exist alternative fuels. That is quite interesting. But you said these things exist. Let's just do it. Isn't that also too fast? You think?
Too fast in terms of what?
In terms of you want a solution here and now. Like Greta Thunberg also want a solution here and now.
Well, I think we want the solution here and now because the solution exists, man. The solution is here and now. It's just the issue is we are not utilizing the solution because the solution is not profitable. We're not utilizing the solution because it's not the easy thing to do.
Yeah. Okay. So you think it's not the easy thing to do?
Yeah, the solution is definitely here and now. It exists, man. Technologies exist. Technologies exist, man. That would radically change the way that we operate the world and radically change the way that that we're impacting the environment.
Yes, that is true. But let me try to do a thought experiment here. So let's say we do this because it's less profitable, meaning that it costs more money to produce, meaning, and let's assume that the firms want to be as profitable as they were before this new innovation and technology, which means that the price of electricity will go up. The price of electricity goes up, everything that relies on electricity also goes up. That means that, and let's bring it to the very basic. I like to use the example of a banana. Now, and milk. I like banana and milk. Now, to produce milk, you milk the cow. Now that is done by machines that use electricity. Also, the bananas. Now, some of them are in greenhouses, and those greenhouses, they need electricity. Now, shipping those using a ship, that because those are in cooler containers, that also needs electricity. Now, the price of bananas will naturally also go up. The price of everything, basically, except banana and milk are just examples here, but the price of um, basic goods will go up, right? So you would actually get poorer. And I think that's something you're not considering by saying, well, we do have the technology. The only reason why the basic necessities that make you consider the moral standpoint, right, are so cheap
Mm-hmm.
because we're doing things that are profitable. Now, if we can do the basic things more profitably, then we can think more about the moral standpoint. And yeah, what do you think about that thought experiment?
I see where you're coming from. Um, if more people start using electricity, the price of electricity will go up, and that's just basic supply and demand laws, right? Um, but this is the thing: if the globe as a whole, if globally we change our production from oil or fossil fuel production and utilization to electric production,
Mm.
then I think the price would subside because we'd have enough supply for that demand. We'd be
Yeah,
able to generate enough supply.
that's interesting. But the cost of production of electricity in that way is more costly than oil. So oil,
Well, that's
you
right
make
now.
a whole. Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. That's
That's
true.
right now because it's not globally utilized. When anything, Karim, is globally utilized, and when the globe uses something altogether, for example, fast food. You know how cheap fast food is now because everyone has McDonald's worldwide, right? That's just an example to name a few. You know.
That's an
Um,
interesting thing. Hmm. Okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into that, because what you're saying here is that, and of course there is a circle here, but the question is, where does it start? So increasing demand yields a lower price. Of course, that's basic, but
mhm.
there is more demand because there is a lower price, right? If McDonald's could not produce their things cheaper than, I don't know, Jim Hortons in Canada, more
Mhm.
people would have gone to Jim Hortons, or at least the same amount of people would have gone there and there.
Yeah. Yeah. But see, this is the thing: Tim Hortons versus McDonald's. Okay, so let's say Tim Hortons. Let's take it back to oil versus gas, and this all
As
ties
you
back into our main driving principle, our main driving goal, our main drive. And our main drive, like I said, is going to change from economic to moral and environmental, right? So people are going to look at McDonald's and Tim Hortons, and they're going to see that, oh, wow, Tim Hortons emits a lot of fossil fuels. Tim Hortons damages the earth so much more. So even though Tim Hortons is cheaper than McDonald's, I'm going to go to McDonald's since McDonald's takes care of the environment and takes care of me so much more. And see, this ties back to people putting the environment on a higher pedestal, prioritizing. People are going to start prioritizing the environment more than what they have in their pockets at the end of the day.
it's quite interesting thing that you're saying right now, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I think not more than 20 minutes ago, I asked you, is it going to be innovation or boycotting that's going to make these moral standpoint? And you said innovation, but now you say boycott. What you're saying,
Well,
in
that's
my
not
ears at
boycotting.
least, sounds as
That's not
boycotting.
boycotting. That's just freedom of choice. They're
Yeah, yeah,
choosing
yeah, yeah,
to go
yeah, yeah. Of course, of
from
course.
their own core beliefs.
Yeah,
Boycotting is not to. They're not choosing, like, when they choose specifically not to go to Tim Hortons and to almost shun and shame because of something. There, it's all about freedom of choice, right? We live in a free country.
yeah,
At
yeah,
least right in the Western world, there are free countries that we live in, and in Europe, right?
yeah,
It's whatever the people want.
yeah.
Anyway, Kareem, if you don't mind, can you just wrap this up because I do have responsibilities and somewhere to be in very short amount of time.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, Omar, for being here. It was really nice to get your perspective on things, um, and the idea of moral standpoints becoming more and more important as the basic necessities of human beings get more and more fulfilled. It was
Hmm.
also interesting to get your insights into behavior of younger people. Um, so yeah, I think I'll give you a minute if you want to have some final remarks. Um, that would be nice.
Um, yeah, well, so my final remarks basically are um, here. The world, my final remarks were pretty much stated, right?
Okay.
It's going to be what I've stated in different words. So there's no need for it, but we need to start worrying about the environment so much more. We need to start looking at because that's what's going to matter,
Yeah.
right? The money that you have right now, materialistic things aren't going to matter in the future if the world is all underwater, you know, and it's 65 degrees Celsius in the summer. That's not gonna benefit anyone. Your Porsche isn't gonna benefit anyone if that's the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's how I want to wrap this up. Thank you
Okay.
so much for this conversation, man. I really things that I didn't even connect together, ideas that I hadn't connected together in the past, I've connected through this conversation, and I really appreciate that.
Well, that's
And
what
I'm
I'm
looking forward to being on the show again in the future.
that's what I'm here for. It's about being open-minded and not and also being informative, right? It's about asking the tough questions and not being afraid of not knowing the exact answer, right? Just thinking out loud. Okay, thanks,
Yeah.
Omar. Do whatever you have to do. Have fun and enjoy your youth.
Thank you. Good luck with the rest of the show.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. So that was Omar for you tuning in. It was very nice to have him on, getting his perspective. Um, and I think that would be a great addition to this podcast to have different people join in and give us their perspective of the world. We go into what I think of is asking them some questions about what their fields of expertise are, and then trying to relate that for you guys into economics, right? Um, if I may just go into the introduction because we were interrupted at the very beginning. Karim talks about economics is about being spontaneous. It's about being informative and about being open minded. You gotta be willing to go where your mind just tries to connect the dots, as Omar said, things that you didn't really, well, you kind of had a vivid idea about, but you had not connected them well together. So that's it's quite important, right? The ability of doing that, the willingness to challenge yourself to be better, right? Usually we say that things have to be broken to be stronger, right? That's what happens to muscles and to bones as well. Now, I do not recommend doing that. Of course, going to the gym, that's nice, but not breaking your bones to make them stronger. But that is also how the mind works, right? You break something that you've thought about for a very long time, and then and you break it by asking a question or getting a question that you never had expected before, and then suddenly um, you develop a new thought because you have to maybe defend it in a certain way, but you will defend it differently, or maybe you will adapt it to the new information that you get, and that is always nice because we as human beings we must not and we should not. Of course, we can, but we're all different. We have our different standpoints, our different morals, and our different viewpoints of the world, right? And that's why my book is the name of my book is The World Viewpoint. But of course, it's from my perspective and the people around me and the world as I experience it. So the agenda usually is that we look at the news, and then we go to a follow-up from last time, a reading, new thoughts, and then a Q&A. Now, while this interview came at the very beginning, um, in the future, this will come in before reading or after the reading, depending on the individual that I have. And maybe we'll even skip the reading and then say that rather than reading, we are inviting Adam Smith to come and talk to us, right? And we're interpreting on what he's saying to us, right? Because if I had Adam Smith, he would say these things. But now Adam Smith would be spontaneous. It would be quite awesome to have him. However, here we have some thoughts that he's thought about for a very long time. So it's kind of the same, but not exactly. So if we start out with the news, so that's a step back. Uh, we see that at least I'm going to start here with the Danish news, which tells us that we have a huge number of new cases, world record of new cases. We see, if we look at the corona here, this is from yesterday. Excuse me, the US of A, the United States of America reached again 50,000. However, not 57 but 54, which is a small improvement, I suppose. Maybe due to less testing, also because it's the weekend, less people are willing to maybe. It was Friday, sorry, so maybe less people are willing to go to the doctors at that day into these testing facilities. Brazil is again over 40,000, 47 yesterday. Today, or the day before, and then yesterday 41 or 40, very close to 42 improvement. India, well, from 21 I think to 22, so still in the 20s. Um, we see that the UK is stable at 500, right? However, as we see, Mexico here is rising quite a lot, and so is South Africa, which is not something that's good to see, because we know that South Africa may not be, well, portraying the right numbers because of the slums that exist there, which is quite troublesome. And the same thing with, of course, Brazil. So I suppose the actual number in Brazil is quite high. Now in France, you have nearly 600 new cases, which for me stands a little bit out. And Saudi Arabia is back at the 4,000s. Uh, the numbers in Saudi Arabia do quite vary. Like, yeah, I think. However, of course, the numbers in the U.S. and Brazil vary much more. However, I'm talking here about the percentages. Now, if we go into other news sources, we see the exact same thing. It's about the U.S. and Trump doing some things about this. We don't know what's really yeah, the U.S. is a whole mess at this point, right? Now, what's interesting here is that it's the 4th of July, and that's, of course, the day where they celebrate the creation of the US. Does it mean something for them that they cannot celebrate out in the open? Definitely, because they are quite, quite fascinated by that day. The BBC, the exact same things. However, here a little bit comments on how the UK is doing after the well, not removing the lockdown, but at least easing it. Fox News, I know it's going to be the same because I saw it. Yes, you see again that the case is increasing, something with Trump. It's always, yeah, the exact same thing is happening. Again, now, actually, in Denmark, and something that I also heard in the radio, I don't know if we can find it up here. No, that's a Danish. Where is it? Well, I don't know where it exactly is. Um, Maybe it's at BBC, but it's the idea. Yep, it's right here. A certain city in Catalonia in Spain right? They want to be their own country. That's a totally different discussion we can have with maybe my friend Silvio. So Catalonia, uh, so a part of Catalonia has been locked down again, and that is because they saw an increase in the numbers of corona cases there. Now, what's interesting here is that I have this website open, which is the price of gold. Let's see if we can get it to work. Yes, and here we have the price of gold from April, right? So when the crisis really started to hit, and now until today. And as you can see, increasing. What does that mean? People are losing the faith in currency, or they're trying to find an alternative investment point for their money. Could of course be also that the central banks are buying up gold. However, I doubt that because there's no real reason for them to buy up gold at this point in day, as there's no golden standard. So it's mostly individuals that want to maintain the value of their money, and the idea is that well, money is really worthless, and buying bonds is also worthless because you get 1% to the most, and in some countries you even get a negative percentage. So what's really the point of, or a zero? So it doesn't really hold the value of the money, right? As more money is being printed out. Now this goes back. Here's a graph that goes back to 74. We see that we are nearing the highest level ever recorded for the price of gold, right? Which is, I don't know if I'm gonna call it troublesome, but at least an indication that people are really thinking about investing elsewhere than the bond market and the stock market and the equity market, right? I'm not going to say the stock market because it could also be ETFs. So it's the equity market. Let's look at silver. Silver usually doesn't really react, right? Because it doesn't hold the value as good as the dollar, as the gold. It's more abundant. And as you can see here, we are not at a top at all. Um, However, one could argue that this is an outlying period, right? And then we might argue that we are at the top, and we could also argue that this is uh, an outlying period. And if that's the case, well, then we are heading towards the top, even in the silver market, not only in the gold market. Now the question is, why do you keep your money in gold? Well, that's only because you have a belief that there exists a community that values gold, right, and will continue to value it as much as they yeah as they value anything else. Um, However, it is a little bit difficult to think about it, right? Because while previously we had the golden standard, it made sense what gold was. At the at this point, it's who's really going to use the gold? Well, you can't go into the shop and tell them, hey, I want 2 bananas for this piece of gold, right? The only thing you can do is go to a goldsmith, I think they are called, or a jewelry store, and tell them, hey, I want to sell this piece of gold. And the thing with gold is that they take a huge markup. There's a huge spread, we call it, right, between the price. So the spread is the space between what they sell you the gold for and what they buy the gold for from you, right? Which can be huge amounts. So here it says uh, um, 1,775, right? Um, they might yes sell you the gold for that, but when they buy it, it might be for 1,400, right? Huge spread, and I saw that because I thought about it for a minute. However, I quickly realized that the value of gold exists in the community that values gold as an alternative currency. However, the question is it going to be an alternative currency at some point? Doubtful. I think it's doubtful. However, it might happen because we know that the Fort Knox in the U.S. has quite a large amount of gold. However, I don't want this podcast to turn into a discussion about gold and whether gold is going to be something new, because we're talking about economics here, right? Uh, we're not gold fanatics. So yes, if we go into the follow up from last time, we can also go through what Omer, at least the bullet points of what Omer was talking about at some point. But let's go back to what we talked about last time with Adam Smith, firstly, and yes, so we had different types of money, which was the idea that you had bills and you had coins, that there existed a currency for the dealers and the dealers and the dealers and the consumers. And those should be different in value because, well, some of them are rotating hands more than others, and some of them are in larger quantities than in others. Dealers and dealers, larger quantity, right? That's why the Bank of England suddenly made a law that you could not circulate something that's less than 10 pounds, which at that point in time was quite a large amount. I don't know exactly what it would be today, but I imagine it would be something like 10,000, maybe even 100,000. I don't know. Then we had risk of commodity degradation translate into less value for the currency, and that relates that relates really to to the two cities, right? Um, to two cities where suddenly the bills were valued differently, because in one city it was um, you were not sure to get the underlying value of the bill back, and therefore the £100 bill would be valued at £96, while in the other city the £100 would be £100 because the guy who had to pay the money back, well, you always were sure that he would. And that of course relates also to a different point, that you had the difference between uh, the banknotes. It's not banknotes, but these promise notes uh, between the U.S., the new colonies, right, and the U.K., the existing empire. And that in the UK, if you came with a £100 note, not £100 note, excuse me, but this promise note of £100, in the US you could get 130 for it, £130, right? Or you could exchange it for 130 promise note, and even in some states to 1,100, um, which is quite a large amount, right? Put that in different perspective, it tells you that for one of these promise notes in the UK, you could have 11 in the US, right? So 1 in 11 would go through, right? Because you want to reach an equilibrium with this when this is equal to this, right? That's how you think about it. It's how you should think about it, just to put things in perspective. Different and something that we also discovered was that there existed a strong parliament with control, and that thought about details, um, and had put laws in place, right? uh, and that and when we read that, we were quite fascinated um, about the different laws that existed, where we had previously thought that maybe those people living the 17th and the 18th century, maybe even the 19th century, were maybe less advanced than us. But it comes to be, or at least it seems to be, from the writing of Adam Smith, that they had a good fundamental understanding of the world and what was happening and the mechanisms and how to control these mechanisms. So you also had a strong government at that point in time, and of course that makes quite good sense, as the UK had could control a fourth of the world. Now, of course, it did not control it as much as one could control it at this point in time with all the new technological advancements. However, it could be controlled to a certain extent, such that you would make these small detailed laws about how much was allowed to be exchanged and how much was not allowed to be exchanged, and to what kind of degree, right, and with whom, and things like that. And the question that we had proposed for this time was, why do some countries prefer or choose um, to have a fixed exchange rate while others have a floating currency? And in Denmark, you have a fixed exchange rate of the Danish krona to the euro. And then I also I've written something underneath it which says dollar as a reserve currency. Let's first um, think about this thing with fixed exchange rate and floating currency. When it comes to a fixed exchange rate, it means that you want your currency to be related to a different currency. Maybe why would you want that? Well, you would want that if you're trading a lot, right? If you want to kind of depend on that other country, because at the end of the day, you will kind of depend on it, right? And why will you depend? Because if that currency rises, your currency will also rise in price. Of course, really to the entire world, both your currencies will rise. Everything kept constant, and if that falls, euro also falls. However, if you want to have a fixed exchange rate between these two, for instance, the Danish krona and the euro, well, that having a fixed currency would enable and ease the trade between those currencies, because the dealers would not have to think about the exchange rate. Because I suppose that's a huge problem in the world that we live in, especially in the globalized world, right? International companies, well, they have to think about, should we have our money in dollars, or should we have them in euros, or in Indian rubles, or in Chinese yen, right? Or Japanese yen. I'm not sure about that one. I have to please excuse me for that. And that's of course a huge thing, right? Because you could lose money just by having currency, just because you have your money in one currency and not the other. So if you're Danish and you trade and you know you're going to trade with Germany a whole lot, 90% of your business is with Germany. Well, you could of course say, well, let's just have the German currency, Deutsche Reichsmark, or now the euro. Uh, However, if those are not quietly available, you will not be able to do that, and therefore you would have to exchange, right? And it's here where the fixed exchange rate plays a role. Now, the idea of a floating currency means that it's the market, it's the forex market, right? That that is going to put the value of your currency. It's going to put it into relation of how well your country is doing, how well your government is doing, but also it will put it in relation to other currencies. So floating currency, for me at least, it means that you're more independent, right? You're a country that is independent, and that and sometimes and here I'm gonna go to the next line where I say that the dollar is a reserve currency for many nations. I can give you the example of Egypt, for instance, that went from a fixed exchange rate to the dollar to a floating one. So we have discussed that the Egyptian pound was overvalued, right? Now, if you wanted to correct the Egyptian currency, what would you do if it had a fixed exchange rate? What you would have to do is to, yes, and you guessed it, degrade degrade the value of the dollar, right? So sometimes a country has a floating exchange rate not just because it's big and strong and it's called the United States of America, but sometimes it's because the currencies which it would otherwise be dependent on, right, don't want them to depend on it. So if the Danish kroner was very weak, right, the euro, and of course Denmark had to be larger, I suppose, the euro might have told them, guys, please stop. Stop it. Stop it. Don't depend on us. Make your currency floating and let the market decide how much it's worth. Don't put it in respect to our currency, right? So that's also a part of it. So that's a different reason why you would have a floating currency, right? It's because the big country don't want you to depend on it. And Egypt is, when you think about it, is relatively a large economy. Now, 100 million, however, their GDP per capita is quite low. However, because it's trading with so many people would want their currencies to go a little bit down, and also if they are trading with the big country, right? So if Egypt is trading with the United States of America, and suddenly the Egyptian pound is strong, well then they are getting more than they should, right? And the US would not want that, and they would carry a deficit there. But if the Egyptian pound is low, they would have to. Yeah, you see where I'm going with this. But on the line it says, well, why is the dollar a reserve currency? Well, that is because those countries, weak countries, right, don't really trust their own currency, right? If they have to do some trade in the world, well, will they do that with their own currency? Well, maybe no one wants their currency beside their own central bank, right? So at that point, they would need the dollar, and also because if their currency fails, they would then have some dollar to keep the country afloat at least for some period in time until they get their 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 economy in order. And that's what happened in, for instance, um, a country that comes to mind, Zimbabwe, where at some point they had a hyperinflation. They had to use the dollar for a period in time, and now they have gone to have a new currency, right? Actually, I saw a small I saw some of their notes, and those are made out of plastic. Now they are scarce, which means that they are high valued, right? Um, so they don't have 100 and things like that yet. They start from the very bottom with five and tens, and they have not even printed the 20s yet, which is quite interesting in my opinion because they had 50 trillion before, right? That's a quite interesting case. Okay, so now that we've followed up, uh, I know that Adam Smith, if we tell him to keep it short, he's only gonna read to us a page, maybe less than a page. No, it's going to be a page and a half. because at that point we'll be at the next chapter. The next chapter is called of the accumulation of capital or of productive and unproductive labor, which is quite interesting because I know quite a lot about labor. But let's see the rest of this chapter first, and we are currently at page 173. Yes. So Pennsylvania was always more moderate in its emission of paper money than any other of the colonies. Its paper currency, accordingly, is said never to have sunk below the value of the gold and silver which was current in the colony before the first emission of its paper money. Before the emission, the colony had raised the denomination of its coin and had, by act of the Assembly, ordered 5s sterling to pass in the colonies for 6s colon 3d, and afterwards for 6s colon 8d, a pound colony currency. Therefore, even when that currency was gold and silver, was more than 30% below the value of £1 sterling. When the currency was turned into paper, it was seldom much more than 30% below the value. The pretense for raising the domination of the coin was to prevent the exportation of gold and silver by making equal quantities of those metals pass for greater sums of the colony than they did in the mother country. It was found, however, that the price of all goods from the mother country rose exactly in proportion as they raised the denomination of their coin, so that their gold and silver were exported as fast as ever. The paper of each colony being received in the payment of the provincial taxes for the full value for which it had been issued, it necessarily derived from this use some additional value over and above what it would have had for the real or supposed distance of the term of its final discharge and redemption. This additional value was greater or less according as the quantity of paper issued was more or less above what could be employed in the payment of the taxes of the particular colony which issued it. It was in all the colonies very much above what could be employed in this manner. A prince who should enact that a certain proportion of his taxes should be paid in a paper money of a certain kind might thereby give a certain value to this paper money, even though the terms of its final discharge redemption should depend altogether upon the will of the prince. If the bank which issued the paper was careful to keep the quantity of it always somewhat below what could easily be employed in this manner, the demand for it might be such as to make it even bear a premium, or sell for somewhat more in the market than the quantity of gold and silver currency for which it was issued. Some people account in this manner for what is called the agio of the Bank of Amsterdam, or for the superiority of bank money over current money, though this bank money, as they pretend, cannot be taken out of the bank at the will of the owner. The greater part of the foreign bills of exchange must be paid in bank money, that is, by transfer in the books. By a transfer in the books of the bank, and the directors of the bank they allege are careful to keep the whole quantity of bank money always below what this use of occasions a demand for. It is upon this account, they say, The bank money sells for a premium to bear an AGO of 4 or 5% above the same nominal sum of gold and silver currency of the country. The account of the Bank of Amsterdam, however, it will appear thereafter, is in a great measure uh, I think this is commercial. A paper currency which falls below the value of gold and silver coin does not thereby sink the value of those metals or occasion equal quantities of them to exchange for a small quantity of goods of any other kind. The proportion between the value of gold and silver and that of goods of any other kind depends in all cases not upon the nature and quantity of a particular paper money, which may be current in any particular country, but upon the richness and or poverty of the mines which happen at any particular time to supply the great market of the commercial world with those metals. It depends upon the proportion between the quantity of labor which is necessary in order to bring the certain quantity of gold and silver to market, and that which is necessary in order to bring thither a certain quantity of any other sort of good. It's a quite interesting part, right? Quite interesting paragraph here where he discusses the idea that maybe, maybe, maybe money is useless. Maybe, right? Because what is really what at least I highlight here and what I take away from this part, this paragraph, is that it's the productivity of the land and the productivity of the labor that really make up the value of all the other goods, right? Because they give you the gold, which so land, no, no, yeah, yeah, let's do it like this, then you can see it. Land, labor, productivity goes into creating the coin. Coin goes and is traded for what we want, the goods, the banana and the milk. It's quite interesting, right? It's quite interesting because the question then becomes, well, how do you value the productivity of the land and the productivity of the labor, right? That's a totally different discussion, I think, and also because here they are relating to the production of gold, right? So the productivity of the land is here portrayed as the mines, right? How much gold can be extracted, gold and silver can be extracted from the mines. Let's continue. If banks are restrained from issuing any circulating banknotes or notes payable to the bearer for less than a certain sum, and if they are subjected to the obligation of an immediate and unconditional payment of such banknotes as soon as presented, their trade may, with safety to the public, be rendered in all other respects perfectly free. The late multiplication of banking companies in both parts of the United Kingdom and events by which many people have been much alarmed instead of increasing the security of the public. An event by which many people have been alarmed instead of increasing the security of the public. It obliged all of them to be more circumspect in their conduct, and by not extending their currency beyond its due proportion to their cash, to guard themselves against those malicious runs which the rivalship of so many competitors is always ready to bring upon them. It restrains the circulation of each particular company within a narrow circle and reduces the circulating notes to a smaller number. This is really about the fear of banking, right? I have to write that down. Uh, I'm gonna write real first, where we took the first post, real value of money, um, right? And secondly, the fear of banking industry, fear of banking, right? I'm going to even highlight that, right? I'm going to highlight where it says it restrains the circulation of each particular company within a narrow circle and reduces their circulation nodes to a smaller number, right? And that relates back to the idea that you could go bankrupt if you did not, right? If you could not pay what was written on the paper money, right? So the first individual. So the idea was that on these more promise notes than banknotes, you had to, the first one who borrowed the money had to write his name, and then he could exchange that, and then that person had to write his name, and it would go so forth, and the bank would, and the last person would then go to the bank if he wanted to exchange that, and then the bank would go to the first person and see if he could pay it. If he could pay it good, the individual would get their money, right? This note is worth something. If not, that person would go bankrupt, and then it would go to the second person, right? That traded with this currency, right? Because he actually used it. He trusted this note and he used it. So that's the whole idea. But here, right, the idea is that it restrains the circulation of a particular company within a narrow circle. So you will only now give this. You will only accept this if you really trust the names that are there, which of course limits the people, because we usually just trust a limited amount of people. Especially in larger sums, you will trust even less people, right? So it becomes even more difficult. But let's see. By dividing the whole circulation into a greater number of parts, the failure of any one company, an accident which in the course of things must sometimes happen, becomes of less consequence to the public. The free competition to oblige all bankers to be more liberal in their dealings with their customers, lest their rivals should carry them away. Right. So banks will become more risky and allow maybe the projects that would elsewise be less productive to take loans. Why? Because otherwise a different bank would accept them. Basically, in the Great Short movie, we saw that when the guy who plays Michael Scott um, in The Office, in the American version of The Office, goes to S&P 500 and looks at how they value these mortgage bonds, mortgage-backed securities, right? And they say, well, if we don't give them an A plus, they would go somewhere else and give them an A plus, right? So that's basically what's happening here. And as I alluded to, and I think I said it quite clearly, I see these notes as bonds. I relate them perfectly to bonds. I don't relate them to currency that we have today, banknotes, $100 bill or something like that. I relate it to bonds, maybe even the mortgage-backed securities here in that case. So I think this is the last sentence now of this chapter. In less the rivals, yeah. So, yep. So competition between banks. And lastly, in general, if any branch of trade or any division of labor be advantageous to the public, the freer, the more general the competition, it will always be the more so. Thanks, Adam. Thank you very much. It was very nice. We're now at page 175. So that was a very, very short reading where we talked about the real value of money, right, which goes into uh, the productivity of land and productivity of labor, uh, the mines in that respect, and the mining work. That's really the value of gold, right? It's nothing else, nothing more. You could say it's the scarcity. Well, that is a direct purport. I think that's the direct opposite of the productivity of the land, which is the mines, right? How much they have in them, right? And how much you're extracting, which depends on the labor that you're putting in. Of course, in modern times, it depends also on the technology, but let's disregard that. And then he also discussed the fear of banking here, that it might be an evil circle, or maybe it even reduces these business circles that would have otherwise existed. And lastly, a competition of banks creates more risk, leads to more risk. I'm gonna write risk-loving banks, right? They are willing to take more risk the more competition, in order to earn a profit, right? It's basic. And I think that the question we can take on to next time is going to be interesting, because before I tell you about that, because to be honest with you, I don't have a question yet. I think it would be worth going through the notes that I wrote when we talked with Omar in the first part of this podcast, the first 40 minutes, I think, or so. Here we discussed the moral standpoints that the youth, the Gen Z, I hope I'm correct in that, are thinking more about a moral standpoint, something that benefits humanity, and that goes beyond the economics. And we talked that may be because the materialistic basic needs of the individuals have been met, and now it has become the turn of, how am I gonna put that, um, things that are more valuable in a sense, right? It's those given goods, as we discussed previously. And I think there's really something here, right? Um, so usually in economics, right, we have an individual, and this individual has a utility. For simplicity, we usually assume that this individual has a utility from consumption, right? And a utility from leisure, right? So consumption is all the basic goods that he needs and everything that he buys with the money. Usually comes from a wage or an income, or sometimes also a wealth that this individual has, right? It can depend on a lot of things. Maybe it also depends on his parents' wealth and something like that. Something like that. Like that, it of course depends on the model which we're analyzing. Now we also have the leisure time, which is the time that he has a spare time, um, which is everything that is not consumption. Now, with what Omer was discussing, that relates a little bit to it, even though it's not directly leading up to it, because you could think of it as materialistic and non-materialistic things. So time is not materialistic, and consumption is the materialistic. right? What you can pay with money. Now, of course, for some, one might argue, well, you can just pay someone to do a different job, and then you have less time. Well, let's look away from that. Uh, and the idea is now that maybe we have increased the, well, we usually assume a utility function that is concave, right? Usually concave. It means that you have, and you have a low amount of money today, you're very unsatisfied, then we increase your money, you're happy. But as we increase your money, your happiness, your utility increases, yes, but not in a straight line. You don't become the exact much more happy when you go from uh, 1 to 100 as from 100 to 200. You're more happy from 1 to 100. You're more happy when you have 1 to a billion than from 1 billion to 2 billion. That's at least the assumption, right? And I think that it makes sense because that's also what you hear from people that are quite rich. They tell you that the first million or the first billion that they created, that was the thing they were the most hyped about. So at this point, at least for Oma, it seems that we have reached, I wouldn't say a plateau, but sort of a plateau with the utility that this individual can gain from consumption, right? That's why materialistic things are not worth anything to him anymore because they are so abundant. And therefore, to increase his utility naturally, it makes perfect sense. He moves into the other thing that can derive utility for him, which is this non-materialistic. Now, a different thing that he also said was this entertainment, fast entertainment thing, right? So maybe he've already gained the utility that he can create for himself through that channel, and now he's been entertained. But what else can he do that's unmaterialistic? Well, he can try to change the world, right? Maybe it's not for the benefit of the world itself, but because, well, I think he has a great heart. It is family, um, but maybe it's also to increase his own utility, and that is, of course, absolutely fine and makes absolutely perfect economic sense, right? A different point that we also talked about was the state versus the people. The argument was his argument was uh, the reason why we think about things that have to be economically feasible is because the state is important, right? The state considers the economic standpoint, while the people think about, well, what's good for them and what's good for their other human beings. So he might be hinting at a disconnection that exists. Now the question is this a disconnection that's new or is it something that has always existed? Well, I think if you ask historians, this disconnection has always existed, right? That's why we have the rise of power of some people and the fall of power from some people. That's why you have demonstrations. It's why you have countries that go into civil wars and things like that. It's because you have an elite that gets disconnected from the people. It feels as if the young generation feels disconnected from the government, or the government feels disconnected. Well, the government doesn't feel disconnected, I suppose, because they have to argue that they are very close to their people. Now, in large countries such as Canada, that is obvious because they can physically not be there. However, the population of the country is much smaller. Now, you can think of the US, that could be total something that's totally totally different, and the situation might be even worse while why you see all this uprising, which is worth noting. That also relates back to what we discussed yesterday about the decision, uh, yesterday or the day before. Uh, what is it that drives political will? Is it, as in the Scandinavian countries, the health of the people? And here I took up this discussion because we discussed how different countries were dealing with the COVID crisis. Is it the health? So there is a trade-off, right, between health and economics. What do you value the most? Some countries, I would argue the Scandinavian countries besides Sweden, have prioritized their health, and the US and the UK have prioritized the economy. Now, the UK have changed that recently. The US would argue that they are prioritizing health. However, the economy, as cannot be hidden, is prioritized higher than the health of the individuals. Otherwise, the lockdown would have been more strict and have lasted for a very long time, and they would have closed down the economy now again because the situation is worse than at the beginning in March and in February, definitely. So Omar might have a point here that there does exist a disconnection between the state and the people. However, it's a little bit difficult to generalize what he's saying because a different individual might say, well, the economy is much more important. The fact that I can buy the newest car every single year is more important to me than the health of the world. Uh, so it's quite interesting to note this. I would argue, as I know a lot of other people have also argued, it might not be that there exists a larger disconnection between the people and the state. It might be that the viewpoints of, I don't know if it's the people themselves, but at least the politicians have become more and more extreme. Right, and that also relates to a different point, the